All right, good morning, everybody. I hope everybody had at least a little bit of a break over spring break. I know you were probably trapped in your house like everybody else, but I hope you had a little bit of time to relax a little bit. I want to go over a few things with you first today before we get started. Obviously, the big thing is that your binder check is tomorrow over chapters 11 and 15. So please take pictures of the pages of Cornell Notes. So you should have 3 front and back pages for each of those 2 chapters. You will need to send those to me by Wednesday night at 11:59. So I need to have those at some point tomorrow. If you find that it is too big to send by email, please save those 12 pictures somewhere in a Google Drive file and then share me the link with those. Please make sure that you make it so that I can access that and not just send me some link that I don't have access to. So please make sure you do that sometime before tomorrow night. Couple other things. First, the College Board did release information about the AP test. I've put that out on the document that I shared out for today. But just to give you a little bit of feedback, they pushed our AP test back by 1 week. It will now be on May the 11th at 4 p.m. And that will be at 4 p.m. regardless of whether we're back in at school or not. So if we come back May 1st, then it'll still be at 4 p.m. on May the 11th. If we're still at home, it'll be at that time. All of those tests will be done electronically online. There will be 2 extended response questions. One that you'll have 25 minutes on. That will be the argumentative essay that you're going to have to write. You'll have 5 minutes to upload that answer, and then you'll have 15 minutes to answer a second question, 5 minutes to upload that one. So 2 questions, May the 11th at 4 o'clock. So if you have questions about that, please let me know. I will be holding office hours on Thursday of this week from 11 until 11:30 a.m. So what I'll do tomorrow is I will send you a link to a Google Meets site that you can get on if you have questions about anything, whether it be the AP test, what we're doing in class right now, just general questions about anything that's going on right now in the world, or anything with your classes at school. Please jump on there and ask me. Obviously not required at all. If you don't want to do that, by all means, you don't have to. But if you have questions about anything at all, please jump on there and ask me questions. I'm going to try to do that every couple of days just to make sure that you have everything that you need kind of moving forward. So binder check tomorrow. Please make sure you get me those notes before midnight tomorrow night. Okay, today we're going to cover a little bit about the bureaucracy, kind of picking up where we left off last week. We had talked about proxy government. And proxy government is the idea that the federal government doesn't hire employees to cover every single position. They pay people at the state and local level to carry out different federal tasks. This keeps the size of the federal government small. One of the big things that politicians always like to brag about is that I shrunk the size of the federal government. Well, as you can see right now with this coronavirus outbreak, having a small federal government that doesn't have a lot of resources is not necessarily a good thing. So obviously every politician wants to save money, but not having people to carry out different tasks is not necessarily always a good thing. So proxy government was really big. Particularly in certain departments, and Homeland Security, FEMA is one of them. So one of the big things that we see with FEMA only has about 2,600 employees, and we saw that after Hurricane Katrina, that they were paying a lot of people at the state and local level to carry out federal tasks. We're seeing that now with the coronavirus outbreak. The reason why the National Guard's been called out in so many states is that we just don't simply have enough federal workers to do certain tasks. So proxy government is significant. Now, there are a lot of critics of proxy government. First of all, some people argue that it's inefficient. We're seeing that very much today. When every state's doing something completely different, that's, again, a component of federalism, but it's also a component of the fact that our federal government just doesn't simply have the resources to do everything at the state level. So critics argue that that's inefficient. Oftentimes it's really hard to track where money's being spent. We saw that with Katrina. There were a lot of trailers that were the federal government built, and they were sending those trailers to Louisiana. And we found out later on that a lot of them never got there. The trailers were in Georgia, they were in Florida, they were in different states, and the people who needed them never got it. And that was really hard to track, as the federal government was just simply relying on the states to do those things. Now, the president and Congress always like to keep the bureaucracy smaller, because it shows that there's fewer people working for the federal government. that's always something that government likes to brag about. We don't like fewer services, but we like fewer people. We like saying that, oh, I shrunk the size of government, but we don't necessarily like it when they shrink our services. So oftentimes, government's able to find all kind of these creative ways to get things done. Summer food programs is a great example of that. The federal government pays for a lot of those, but they're carried out by local schools, local churches, things like that, in order to still provide the service. So when we look at the bureaucracy, we're looking at the people who are carrying out the actions of the executive branch. Now, nowhere in the Constitution is the bureaucracy mentioned at all. What it says about the president is that the president gets to appoint judges to the Supreme Court and all other officers of the United States provided for and which shall be established by law. Now, we've taken that last part to kind of assume that this means that the president can appoint people to other positions within the government. So it never mentions departments, bureaus. It never mentions that we're going to have a State Department or a Justice Department or a Dr. Anthony Fauci doing health things for the country, anything like that. Nowhere is that in the Constitution. We've just kind of interpreted it. The first cabinet department we ever really had was the State Department, and the State Department was really created in a real sense. Now, we had cabinet positions before under Washington and Adams, but the first really big cabinet department we had was to assist Thomas Jefferson. The United States grew fairly significantly in the 1800s with the Louisiana Purchase and some other things, and our relationship with other countries was fairly complicated. So Jefferson needed people to assist him. So we set up the State Department, and we had all of these different things that was that were there. Now, the State Department, when Jefferson ran it under Washington, he had some staff who worked for him, and this was significant. When he became president, the State Department really grew. So the State Department is the one we always look at as the first really big cabinet department. Even though there were several that were established at the exact same time, we call the State Department the first cabinet department. It's first in the line of succession after we get through the vice president, the speaker, and the president pro tempore. Now, with our cabinet secretaries and the people who head these departments, they are removable by the president alone. So at any point, the president can ask the heads of these bureaucratic agencies to step down. He can replace them with somebody else, anything like that. So that's fairly common for the president to be able to do. And that was something that Congress debated about a lot. But really, since these executive agencies are there to help the president fulfill their job, Congress kind of conceded that the president should be able to remove these people. Now, Congress has to approve them. If I want to nominate a Secretary of State, Congress has to be able to approve them there, but the president has the ability to remove them from that office at any time. Now, with that being said, Congress did not give up all control, like they don't give up all control on anything. Congress still appropriates money to different departments. So if Donald Trump wants to create a new cabinet department, Congress would have to approve that. If he wants to name some person to a cabinet department and Congress doesn't like it, Congress can just simply not allocate money to that department. Congress also has the ability to investigate departments and administrations. We've seen that with all of these cabinet officials being called before Congress to answer a bunch of questions. They still have the power to investigate. That's a strong power that Congress has. Now, they also have, and we'll talk about this later in the chapter, the ability to shape the laws that are carried out by those departments. If you know that the president is your boss, but Congress is your funding, sometimes you might act the way Congress wants you to act as opposed to acting the way the president wants you to act, because Congress is the one who's going to give you money at the end of the day. So oftentimes these bureaucratic people, whether they're cabinet directors or somebody else, are torn of who they listen to, whether it be the president or Congress. So when you look at some of our early cabinet departments, the State Department under Washington only had 9 employees, so very small. Department of War didn't have over 80 employees by the time we got to 1801. So when Jefferson became president, Department of War only had 80 people who worked there. The Treasury didn't really do anything except for collect taxes. Now, if you remember, before the income tax was collected, that this was only really property taxes and sales taxes. So there wasn't a whole lot of money to go around at the federal level. So they had a large number of employees, but that number really blew up once the 16th Amendment was passed. That really changed the number of people in Congress. The number of people in that cabinet department. And the only real cabinet department that ever really carried out any direct person-to-person interaction was the post office. They were the ones who would actually interact with the American people. Most people today will never interact with anyone from the State Department or interact with anybody from the Department of the Interior unless it's at a national park. Never interact with anybody from Homeland Security unless it's at a TSA screening at an airport. So it's very uncommon that we interact with a lot of these cabinet officials. Now, who the president appoints to these offices is critical. And presidents have often found the task of appointing people to be difficult over time. And we can kind of look at the Trump administration and really see that. These cabinet officials have to do a lot of things. They have to oftentimes interpret the law. So the ideology of those people is important. So when Congress passes a law and the EPA has to carry it out, then who's interpreting that law as the EPA director is really, really important. So the person the president puts in that position is critical. So these officials affect how laws are interpreted. They also affect the tone of the administration. The character of that person is important. We want to make sure that we can trust that that person is giving us good information. And this is something that can really be problematic if you have somebody who's not viewed as an expert on a certain topic. That person can also affect how business gets done. The competence of that person is important. So their day-to-day management style, whether they're willing to allocate things to the people below them. And then the party affiliation. It is not uncommon, and Barack Obama actually did this when he became president. He kept the defense secretary the same as the Bush administration. We were in the middle of the war in Afghanistan. He said there's really no reason to change the Secretary of Defense in the middle of a war, so he kept on the Republican Secretary of Defense. He had several Republicans who served in his administration. Now, that is not the norm. Most presidents get rid of everybody and bring in their own people, but it has happened before where a president will just simply keep on somebody because they have expertise in that area. So even though it's oftentimes someone from your own party, it doesn't necessarily have to be. So who those appointments are is critical. Now, if you look at the Trump administration today, he's obviously cycled through a lot of different people in his cabinet. He's had more cabinet officials during his first term than any president in American history. And these people usually cycle through, for most presidents, they stay on for at least 4 years. Very rarely, if a president serves 8 years, does the same cabinet secretary serve all 8 years. That's very rare. What is rare is that Trump has had 2 or 3 already in his first term in most of these cabinet positions, outside of energy, housing and urban development, and a couple others where we've had consistency. There's been a lot of turnover in the cabinet. Now, that oftentimes creates chaos within some of those agencies, is that if the leader is changing regularly, that's going to create chaos. Think about taking a class and your teacher changes 3 times during the year. You don't really know what the expectations are for you there. The same thing holds for the bureaucracy. Hey, all right, last thing for today, and we'll finish up kind of the history of the bureaucracy tomorrow. What we saw during the 19th and 20th centuries, so 1800s, 1900s, is that Congress was the dominant branch of government for the vast majority of that time. We talked about some of those strong presidents, Andrew Jackson, Abraham Lincoln, and basically up until FDR, we really didn't have any strong presidents. Congress was the dominant branch. Thus, they were the ones who controlled a lot of the bureaucratic appointments. Even though the president ultimately got to pick the person, Congress gave them a lot of feedback about who they wanted them to pick. Now, that was oftentimes related to patronage, who got some of these jobs. And that held until we got the Pendleton Act passed, which you talked about earlier this year. Pendleton Civil Service Act, which was passed after the assassination of President Garfield, changed the way we started appointing some of these positions. Now, from 1816 until 1861, the number of federal jobs in the U.S. increased by 8 times. And there's one big reason for that, is that our country got way bigger. If you think of what our country looked like between 1816 and 1861, by the time we get to 1861, California is now a state. We're all the way out to the West Coast. Most of that job growth was in the Postal Service. We had to deliver mail from New York to California. So we needed a lot of people to be able to do that. Now, there were a lot of private sector things. You've heard of the Pony Express and things like that that were delivering mail. But the federal government controlled a lot of that. So A lot of that job growth was there. It was also building up the military. Now, all of this was before the 16th Amendment, so we didn't have income tax yet. So it wasn't something where we were significantly growing the scope of government like we've done today. Now, the Civil War is going to lead to a lot more hirings, and we'll talk a little bit tomorrow about the significant growth in the cabinet that we saw after the Civil War, as the Civil War started to bring out some problems that we saw in our country that we didn't really think about before the war. Hey, all right, I'll stop there for today with the notes. We'll pick this up tomorrow, looking at kind of the history of the bureaucracy a little bit more. Remember, your binder check is due by tomorrow, so please make sure that you get me those 6 pages front and back of notes from chapters 11 and 15. That is going to be due to me by midnight tomorrow night, so please make sure that you have that to me just as quickly as possible. If you have any questions, send me an email. Hope everybody's a good day.